My name is Ben Burgis. I am the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, out now from Zer0 Books. And as I am recording this, we are at the night before the Iowa caucus. I don't know yet whether Bernie is going to win the caucus. I don't think it's disastrous if he doesn't. It just means it's going to be a longer march to the nomination. But obviously it'd be very nice if he did. But I don't know. And I certainly don't pretend to have the answers to any of the bigger questions, like whether he is in fact going to win the Democratic nomination, whether if he wins the nomination, he'll win the general election. I certainly think that he has a better chance of beating Trump than any of the other Democrats. But it would be foolish to pretend that we can be absolutely certain about how the election is going to play out. And most importantly, I don't know if he and really us, right, the left, the grassroots movement supporting him, will be able, if he does win the presidency, to overcome the massive amounts of obstruction and sabotage, attempted co-optation, and general horrific monkey business from both parties and the entire establishment that's surely going to come his way if he's elected and tries to carry out his social democratic agenda. I think it's worth a shot. I think this is the only game in town as far as moving the ball forward for socialist politics in America. If you want to accomplish more radical things in the future, I think given where we are, we have to start with social democracy. In any case, despite all those questions still being open, one thing I do take encouragement in is that people who absolutely hate social democracy, much less socialism, the left in general, are starting to worry about Bernie Sanders. So, for example, I've watched this several times at this point. It's just an amazing video. Here is friend of the channel, Ben Shapiro.
And you can tell what is really animating the Sanders campaign has nothing to do with his plans, has nothing to do with his spending, has nothing to do with where he wants the country to go. What really is animating Bernie Sanders' campaign is hatred for all that is. It's hatred for the quote-unquote status quo. And his surrogates say this. So Michael Moore is a big Bernie Sanders fan. And he's out there saying that we are like the French resistance. See, it's not what Bernie is for that matters. It's what Bernie is against. Bernie is against capitalism. Bernie is against the American system. Bernie is against American history. Bernie is for a complete overthrow of the American system wholesale, and Michael Moore is totally into it. Here's Michael Moore characterizing Bernie Sanders' opposition as basically Nazi-esque and suggesting that Bernie Sanders is the French resistance, which is an amazing statement given the fact that Bernie Sanders, during World War II, if he had been a politically active man at that time, would have been on the side of the USSR, which at the beginning was at least on the side of the Nazis. In any case, that's not to say Bernie Sanders is the Nazi. The point is that to characterize Bernie Sanders' opposition as Nazi-esque and Bernie as a French resistance member is ridiculous on his face.
The hysterical red baiting with which that clip ends tells me that other Ben is starting to get quite worried about the prospect of Bernie Sanders' candidacy and a Bernie Sanders presidency and everything that might bring to the country. He clearly hasn't been paying very much attention beforehand. The reason he hasn't been paying very much attention to Bernie before is that even for Ben Shapiro, who is certainly not above strawmanning his political opponents, the mischaracterization of Bernie's policies at the beginning of the clip, Shabazz, is so severe that I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt that he just literally doesn't know what he's talking about. Because anybody who had so much as bothered to watch any of the Democratic debates would know that this is not some damning accusation that there's not enough money at the top to fund all of Bernie's programs with redistributive taxation. This is something that the man himself regularly talks about when it comes to, different programs are financed differently. Free college, for example, free at the point of service, paid for by taxation. Wouldn't even need to involve soaking the rich. It would actually, you could actually pay for that with an extremely modest, barely noticed kind of modest tax on Wall Street transactions. That just tells you something about the volume of Wall Street transactions compared to the price tag of higher education. But when it comes to something like Medicare for All, it's true that would involve middle income taxes going up. But, of course, if you know the most basic arithmetic of this, you should be able to get the point that if you are a middle income taxpayer and your taxes go up, but your private insurance premium, copay, deductible, all that stuff disappears, then you would still save money. Right? So, in fact, you have to be pretty rich not to save money on this, just because pooling all of our money together, paying for it by progressive taxation rather than in this clumsier way, not having a bunch of different competing health insurance bureaucracies that all need to be paid for, and of course not having shareholders who need to take a massive cut of the money that we're spending on healthcare as their profits, means that the whole thing would be vastly more efficient and most people would save money. I know I'm really burying the lead here because that is not nearly as much fun as what he says about Bernie Sanders and World War II. So, let's talk about that. I think that he threw in the thing about the Nazis at the end because he realized that if he hadn't thrown that in, what he would essentially be accusing Bernie Sanders of is having hypothetically been just a regular patriotic American who, of course, would have supported our allies, including the Soviet Union, against our enemy, Nazi Germany, who the Soviets were fighting. So in order to, escalate from that not very damning accusation of just having had the standard patriotic American position during the war, hypothetically, he has to say, well, Bernie's, it's a fact. That's such a fascinating way to put this. It's a fact that Bernie Sanders would have, yes, I hear you, would have supported the Soviet Union, which at the beginning at least was on the Nazi side of the war. Now, the claim about history here is bizarre. Anybody who is paying attention in sixth grade world history should know better. But just to briefly recap, the tiny germ of truth in all of this is that after spending most of the 30s as enemies who had not yet gone to war, right? Everybody understood that collision between the two was inevitable. There was a stay of execution on that war in 1939 when Stalin and Hitler made a non-aggression pact, sometimes called the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or usually the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because those were the Soviet and German diplomats who negotiated it, under which they agreed they wouldn't go to war with each other, although they certainly spent those 2 years building up their armaments in preparation for that war. Apparently Stalin was surprised by how quickly Germany reneged, but he knew it was coming. And again, the germ of truth in Other Ben's bizarro version of the history of World War II is that while that non-aggression pact was going on, part of what that allowed was for each of the two powers to take a separate bite out of Poland, erasing, Poland between them, and neither of them interfering with the other's expansion towards each other. But that's a very different thing from what Other Ben is saying there. Just to take this off, even though neither interfered with either's annexation of the respective parts of Poland, there was never any sort of coordinated military operations that they were engaged in against the Allies. In fact, the Soviet Union never declared war on any Allied power. No Allied power ever declared war on the Soviet Union. And certainly the Soviet Union never fought any Allied power. So this idea that Ben is suggesting that they were on the Nazi side of the war is just bizarre. And, look, Stalin was very bad, right? I'll make that bold statement. He did lots of very bad things. So why make up, bad things that he didn't do, like fight on the Nazi side of the war? All right, whatever. Disregard Ben Shapiro's very odd version of history and just focus on his counterfactual claim that if he had been a political man during World War II, Bernie Sanders would have, I guess, to steelman this, make the least ridiculous version of the claim instead of supporting the Soviet Union in some sort of hypothetical state of war it was never in against the Allies. I guess what we can take Ben as meaning here charitably is Bernie Sanders would have supported the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939 if he'd been a political man during World War II. All right. So, first things first, the reason that Bernie Sanders was not, despite being very old today, a political man during World War II is not that he was, a really politically apathetic young man. It's that he was born in 1941. He was all of 7 months old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And I think it's fair to say Bernie Sanders was no more politically apathetic than your average 7-year-old at the outbreak of hostilities between the United States and the Axis powers. But certainly in 1939, he was at his most apathetic because he didn't exist. Even by Ben Shapiro standards, he didn't exist because he hadn't been conceived yet. Let's pretend that we can put Bernie Sanders in 1939 as an adult with political opinions. Trying to evaluate the truth conditions of this counterfactual conditional is very tricky. Look into a little modal logic and the metaphysics of modality is what this particular hyper-nerdy area of analytic philosophy is called. This is incredibly complicated stuff. Trying to figure out what would ground the truth. If you think there's a fact about what he would have done, what are we even talking about here? Because we can come up with various people to have hypothetically exist in 1939 as adults with political opinions who'd be more or less similar to Bernie Sanders, and have some of them have very different opinions from each other. So that's kind of funny too. But let's just focus, let's just say, again, try to be hyper charitable about this, that what we're talking about when we imagine this scenario is we take Bernie Sanders with the actual political opinions that he's had throughout his adult life. So starting with his membership in college, in the YDS, the Young Democratic Socialists, the youth wing of the old Socialist Party of America, the party of Norman Thomas and Eugene V. Debs, going through his activism in the civil rights movement, going through his involvement in the Liberty Union Party in Vermont, which was a radical third party that had a platform that went way beyond the kind of social democratic agenda that Bernie Sanders is talking about now, up through his comparatively mellower, though still radical by the standards of American politics, current positions. Okay, let's assume that hypothetical adult in 1939 with political opinions, Bernie Sanders, is somebody who had political opinions that resembled ones that he had at any point during that time period, from his college student involvement in the Young Democratic Socialists up through his 2020 run for president. Well, if that's what we're talking about, then the fact is that somebody who existed at that time, who had political opinions bearing any resemblance to Bernie Sanders during any phase of that long political career, would have absolutely opposed the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which we know because pretty much the entire socialist left opposed it, with the exception of members of the Communist Party USA, which was aligned with the Soviet Union, and whose members were obliged under party discipline to toe the party line. Everybody who was a socialist who wasn't a member of the Communist Party, which Bernie Sanders, to answer the old McCarthyite question, was never a member of, opposed the Hitler-Stalin Pact, viewed it as a grotesque betrayal of socialist principles, And in fact, not only did everybody outside the Communist Party oppose it, but a huge number of people who were members of the Communist Party at the beginning of 1939 left in protest over the Hitler-Stalin Pact, because they had been told for the last few years leading up to that, the party line had been that everybody had to get together in a big popular front to oppose fascism, and everybody was very motivated by the anti-fascist struggle that was at the core of their vision of politics. And then they were suddenly being told, forget about the anti-fascist struggle because of what looked very much like naked Soviet self-interest. People who had been party fellow travelers, tended to be very against this. It was sort of the hardcore of Stalinist dead-enders who stayed in the party at that point until 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The party flipped its position. And then actually from 1941 up until the beginning of the McCarthy period was the high watermark of the Communist Party in America, the U.S. That's when it had its largest membership, and I think not surpassed by a socialist organization until like the DSA now. All right. So, would Bernie Sanders, if he'd had politics that resemble the politics he'd had at any stage of his actual career in 1939, being one of those Stalinist dead-enders who stuck by the CPUSA? Well, obviously not. If we look at any stage in that long progression, he's changed his mind about various issues. When he was in the Liberty Union Party, he was talking about workers' control of the means of production in general. And now he's talking about comparatively more modest things like just socializing the health insurance industry, which would obviously be one of the most important victories for left politics in American history, baby steps. Throughout that entire career, one of the things that has remained absolutely constant is that he has always called himself a democratic socialist, because he has been so far from being a Stalinist dead-ender that he has always felt the need to call himself by an adjective that would differentiate whatever he means by socialism at any phase of his career from Soviet-style authoritarian model socialism. Now, you can say maybe he wouldn't have, maybe actually if Bernie Sanders had, he'd been kidnapped by time travelers as a baby in 1941 and brought back to 1921, so that when the Hitler-Stalin Pact actually happened, he really, he was 18 years old. And maybe, as a matter of fact, I have no idea what transdimensional crystal ball you'd have to peer into to discover this modal fact, but maybe in that world he actually would have been a hardcore Stalinist in 1939. It's possible. It's also possible that if Ben Shapiro had been an adult in the same period and had been in the Warsaw Ghetto, that he would have been part of the collaborationist Jewish administration that worked with the Nazis. That he wouldn't have been with the rebels. I don't know how we'd ever go about proving it, and it seems like a vicious, horrible thing to say. Although I will say, Ben Shapiro said he wouldn't kill baby Hitler. Look that up. But really, that shows how silly this is, and all we should get out of this is the Ben Shapiros of the world are frightened of the possibility of Sanders' ascendancy, which tells you everything you need to know about why we should hope for a Sanders victory.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.